I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Join us as we quest for the awe and wonder of knowing we are part of something infinitely larger than ourselves.
One of the things that I really love about etymology is sometimes you just get these word pictures and then you can't not see them anymore. For example, the term gladiolus comes from the Latin gladium or gladius, which means sword, because the gladiolus has sword-shaped leaves, and in German it's Schwertlily, sword lily.
I'm so glad I got to cross paths with Martha Barnette. Now, I know a glad in the garden when I see one, but my use here of glad for happy doesn't actually share the Latin root gladius, which Martha just mentioned, meaning sword. Although, as it happens, the Germanic root glad does mean shiny, not unlike a gleaming sword. Well, given Martha's expertise with language, I'll not dare cross verbal swords with her as if I could compete. Instead, I was glad to have a perfectly playful, friendly bout with her, a scintillating exchange.
If you're having a sparkling conversation, that's scintillating, and you might say, I'm not going to give you one scintilla of this or that. That, again, is something that's as tiny as a spark.
Martha Barnette is co-host of Away with Words, the long-running NPR podcast and radio show where she and her co-host Grant Barrett field probing questions about language. They talk with callers about everything from word origins to regional idioms and endlessly curious and sometimes downright weird figures of speech. We caught up with her because of her book, Friends with Words, Adventures in Language Land. For some folks, just hearing terms like grammar, word origins, or even Latin makes them feel queasy or at least a little clammy. But Friends with Words displays Martha's gift for engaging these topics in a perfectly inviting way. This, and her earlier books about language, are replete with good humor and ease of expression. She sheds a warm, comfortable light on the magic of verbal communication, celebrating the sheer bounty of it all. Martha finds the world of words vivid, surprising, welcoming. I don't have enough adjectives. Visit this place she calls Language Land, and you might even find yourself reflected in one of her word stories. I had a chance to visit with her about her word-filled upbringing, which included meaningful guidance from each of her parents, and as we went along in our conversation, we couldn't resist tossing around a few fascinating words. I wanted to get going today doing a little something unusual, actually, because I think you're a kindred spirit. We like each other already, and we just met. And here's how I know. I'll tell you how this works with a little story. 3 weeks ago, I had back surgery, and as I was preparing my mind and my heart for going under the knife for them to take out some bone that was giving me sciatica, I said to myself, well, what am I supposed to be thinking of as I was approaching the surgery? They wheel you into the room, and you meet the anesthesiologist, and they're going to tell you the countdown. If you've had surgery before, you're prepared for this. And I said to myself, radiculopathy is a medical term they've been using to describe my condition. I am a gardener and I like radishes, and I know that radishes, and I don't like weeds as much, and so I eradicate the weeds, and this is kind of the way I start. And I was so happy to be thinking about the roots of roots. A lot of people aren't like this, but I kind of think you and I might be kindred spirits.
I think we absolutely are. And Marcus, I think that is a truly radical idea. Yet another word that comes from the Latin radix, meaning root.
I like your family history, too, that I've read about, because that converges with the roots of language and the roots of family. And I think we should find out where you came from, a little bit about your roots.
Oh, my goodness. We really are fellow nerds, aren't we? I can tell that already. No wonder they call this constant wonder, right? My roots, I actually have Appalachian roots. I didn't grow up in Appalachia, but my father did. He was a proud hillbilly. He was born at the foot of Sugarloaf Mountain in western North Carolina and grew up in abject poverty there. He was actually born in a log cabin there in 1911. So he had a very, very impoverished childhood. When he was a teenager, he was 13 years old, weighed 74 pounds, worked in a textile mill where you could just reach out and grab a handful of lint. Those folks were called lint heads. It was a disparaging term, lint head. You were somebody who worked in the mill. And he had a transformative experience when he was 19, and he decided to become a Baptist preacher. And he sort of educated himself, worked his way out of the mill, reading books, having a dictionary and a Bible next to his workstation and studying when he had breaks. And eventually he became a professor of Christian ethics, did graduate work, and moved to Louisville, Kentucky.
Can I interject a quick question here?
Sure.
This sounds to me a child working in the mills who wants to become a preacher. He was kind of saying, God, get me out of here. He had a prayer in his heart to get out of that awful place.
Oh, absolutely. And I think he had this sense of how do I connect with something bigger than myself? How do I connect with the rest of the world? There's got to be, this larger element to life than merely subsisting. And so his curiosity drove him to study. He dropped out of high school to work in the mill, and then he went back at age 19 to high school and taught himself algebra by lamplight and eventually Latin and Greek, and went on to college at Wake Forest University in North Carolina, and eventually ended up in Louisville, Kentucky, where the Baptist Seminary is. And that's where my story starts, because that's where I was born. But those are my roots, and they're very, very important to me.
Well, those are certainly roots on one side of the family, and we will talk about your mom in just a little bit here. But what a remarkable guy. What an utterly remarkable person.
Oh, for sure, for sure. He was constantly reading. He lived to the ripe old age of 93. When I went to visit him just before his death, there were Post-its all over the house of Japanese words. He was teaching himself Japanese because he had a Japanese friend that he wanted to communicate with. So he was constantly teaching himself and learning from others.
The show that you do, Away with Words, and the kind of people, the kind of audience it draws, you don't have to be a word geek to like that show, I don't think.
No, I don't think so. I think it's really about people and communication and, again, things that people are curious about. I mean, we get calls from all over the United States and Canada and actually all over the world, because if you start to think about the world around you and the words that we use to discuss it, there's an awful lot to be curious about. There's so many words that have stories locked inside them, and they're hiding right there in plain sight if only you know how to unlock those stories. And so that's a lot of what we do on the show. But we also talk about regional dialects, differences in language, linguistic diversity, and words from other languages as well. I think of Away with Words as a real celebration of language, but that means a celebration of humans. We've got this incredible gift. The fact that I can make marks on a page and you can kind of understand, maybe not absolutely completely, but you can kind of understand, for example, where I came from, my roots, or just the fact that with a mouthful of air and some muscles moving around in my mouth, you're understanding what I'm saying.
I remember being in 6th grade, Mrs. Palermo's class, and I was suddenly looking at my paper, and I had just written the word, I remember this as though it were yesterday, I'd written the word Kitchen, and I sounded it out, I knew the word, I'd known it for a couple of years, and the more I said it to myself, the more bewildered I felt about what seemed to be a nonsense sound, kitchen, and it made perfect sense, but it made no sense that it should ever make sense. Is that to celebrate?
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, language is an amazement. I mean, you see these seemingly arbitrary symbols on a page, but they mean something. They tell you something, and you can pass that along to somebody else and let them know that you were thinking about a kitchen. I mean, it really is this miraculous thing. I don't ever want to lose that sense of, wonder about these words that we use every day.
And your mother was a type of person who was under the sway of this spell of words.
Oh, she absolutely was. My mom was an English teacher from a little town in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. She taught language arts in middle school, and she was also a really funny and really dramatic person. And so she was always coming up with clever ways to help kids remember how to spell this or that word. I remember she would tell kids who were having trouble with the ending of the word cemetery, is it E-R-Y or A-R-Y? Well, she would say, think of going through a cemetery at night. You go E all the way through. And she knew that it was silly, but she'd rather have the kids making fun of her than making fun of each other, 8th graders or sometimes a tough audience. But she would just do fun things like that. And I absorbed that as a kid. I picked up English grammar by osmosis.
You actually sat outside of school hours with your mom diagramming sentences. That just sounds almost like, we don't do that to kids.
Yeah, it's pretty nerdy. And as a treat, she would let me correct her spelling tests. My mom was a teacher, and I saw her come home absolutely exhausted every day. I have so much respect for teachers because she really put it out there every day. And so now when I think back to how she let me grade her spelling tests, I think that there might have been something else going on. But for me, that was a real treat.
Go figure.
Yeah, right.
So you have two parents who are passionate about language. And then you start looking at your life and your potential career, and you launch out, I believe, as a journalist. Was that in any way because of this family legacy of language love, or was this in spite of it?
Oh, what a good question. I would say it's because of the language love that I saw. And embarrassingly enough, I don't talk about this, but do you remember the show The Waltons?
Oh, of course. Grew up with it.
Yeah. Remember John Boy Walton would put on his glasses and stick them behind his ears, and he would always say, I want to be a writer. And I don't know, that really influenced me. I loved John Boy, and so I wanted to become a writer in part because of that. But I was always observing the world, I guess, and thinking about the words that we use to describe it. And then I also had a bit of a transformative experience in college when I got into ancient Greek.
Yeah, I do want you to share the story of this gentleman, Leonard from Latvia. How did you cross paths?
Well, I had some, like you, I'd had some Latin in high school, and I really enjoyed it. But when I got to college, I thought, I've tasted some Latin. Let me try Greek, because then I could read Homer in the original and Plato and all those folks.
Oh, you didn't really want to do any of that. You wanted respect of the important people of the world or something.
That's funny. Well, yeah, I guess I had this image of myself in a comfy chair next to a fireplace, sipping tea and, reading Homer on a wintry night. But yeah, Plato was tough, I have to say. That was a little more challenging.
Still is tough, by the way. He's going to stay that way for a long time.
Yeah. There's a lot to work with there. But I thought that studying Greek would be cool. But what I found out was that it was really, really hard, at least for me. When you take an ancient Greek class, it's not like you're going to be able to talk to anybody unless you run into somebody who's Greek and 2,000 years old. And so instead of conversational ancient Greek, the first lessons were things like, how do you say, it was a metaphor, or they have bowstrings, or he has large armies, which really doesn't lend itself to talking with other people. So it was kind of a lonely pursuit. But also, I just found it really hard because it's a different alphabet and the grammar is, I don't know, did you do Greek as well as Latin?
I had a semester and it scared me right off. It was an introduction to the Greek New Testament. There was something here, though, I think that was parallel to your experience, which is the approach of the teacher was, we're going to give you a real ancient text, we're going to shove it in your hands, and we're going to open up to page 1, and we're going to start and dig in.
Yeah. That's pretty much what happened to me. I just found it really challenging, and rather than flunk the class and have that humiliation, I decided to drop it at the very last second. But I made a promise to myself that I would go back home to Louisville that summer and find some starving graduate student who could tutor me in ancient Greek. But that embarrassment turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me, almost flunking that class, because I ended up studying with an elderly man from Latvia. As you said, his name was Professor Leonard Latkovski, and he was a polyglot. He spoke more than a dozen languages, just easily. And he was a retired professor of classics at Bellarmine University in Louisville. And he was just one of these born teachers. So he started teaching me Greek on Monday nights, and I think sometimes he would teach Turkish on Tuesdays, and Hebrew on Wednesdays, and Italian on Thursdays. The first time I went in to see him, I was thinking we would go over the dreary drills in my elementary Greek book. He took my Greek textbook and he just threw it aside, and he said, "We will read this." And I looked at the book, and it was Oedipus Rex, Oedipus Tyrannus in ancient Greek, the great play by Sophocles. And I thought, this is nuts. How can I read an ancient Greek tragedy when I barely can get through the alphabet? But the way he taught me turned out to be pretty revelatory and actually set me on this path of finding out every word origin and etymology that I could.
He was somebody in your life for many years. He wasn't just a semester's mentor.
That's right. Yes, I studied with him actually for 12 years, and he taught me in a different way. He said, well, let's start with the name Oedipus. You have in English, do you not, the word edema? And I said, well, sure, edema means swelling. And he said, exactly. He said, Oedipus is related to the English word edema, and the pus in Oedipus, which means foot, is related to the animal with 8 feet and the octopus. And he just went on from there. And I started to see all these connections and links between all these different languages that arise from Indo-European, that it was just this amazing way of teaching somebody about language. And so I did. I studied with him for 12 years until his death. He just blew my mind, because we would take one word and all of a sudden we were talking about botany, and then we were talking about mathematics, and then we were talking about ancient history or medicine, because we just kept going off on all these etymological tangents that were just delightful. And so I went back that fall and aced my ancient Greek course, and then I took every single ancient Greek course I could after that, the rest of my college career. And then I got out of college and I thought, well, what am I going to do with ancient Greek? I'll never use that again. So I went on to a career in journalism, but I always had this nagging tug at me to go back and study more Greek. And so while I was working as a journalist in Louisville, I would study with the professor every week, and we just kept it up for years.
Extracurricular activity. I don't know. What do we call it? You're working during the day as a journalist.
Yeah.
And how many evenings a week would you visit the professor?
Oh, just once a week. But we just had a wonderful time. And I'm thinking about the word curricular. You know, it's a word that comes from Latin meaning to run. It's related to course and current, all those words involving running. So if something is extracurricular, it's outside of that running track.
And with that word's root as my cue, don't run away just yet. We're about to hear more from Martha about the polyglot Leonard Latkovski who inspired her, and how her experience with him resulted in a lifelong calling. Martha Barnette is author of Friends with Words, Adventures in Language Land. And you can also hear her on the podcast and radio show Away with Words. You're listening to Constant Wonder. I've got another podcast to recommend to you from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's called The Appleseed. Each episode features master storytellers sharing all kinds of stories for you and your family, folk tales, fairy tales, personal and family tales. It's ideal for road trips, bedtime, or any time you're looking for something that the whole family can enjoy together. And here's a great side effect of listening to The Appleseed. It has a nearly magical ability to conjure up a whole lot of healthy storytelling right at home, and it often prompts the sharing of precious memories as well. Be sure to catch The Appleseed wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. There's such a tender story you tell about the time surrounding Leonard's passing.
Yes, his daughter called me one day and said her father had gone to the shopping mall and collapsed and he was in the hospital, and would I want to come and visit him? And I said, well, of course, I'll be there tonight. And so I walk into his hospital room, and even if they'd taken him out for a test or something, I would have guessed that it was his hospital room because there were newspapers lying around in 3 different languages, for starters. But he was there. And he seemed in very good spirits. We talked about a lot of things. For some reason, that night he was wanting to talk about gemstones. Whenever he came up with a topic, I just let him go and took notes. But he wanted to talk about gemstones, and in particular, the gemstone alexandrite, which looks different depending on what kind of light it's in. I think it's called ruby by day, emerald by night, or something like that, because if it's under artificial light, it looks one color, and if it's in regular daylight, it looks different. And he wanted to talk about alexandrite because it's named for Alexander of Russia, and it comes from the Ural Mountains there in Russia. So we had this lovely conversation about gemstones, and he said, we will study gemstones. And he started lighting up just thinking about planning out this little mini course of study that we'd have when he got out of the hospital. And he looked great. But I have to say that when I finally was ready to leave, I was standing in the doorway, and as I was leaving, he said, "No me olvides." At the time, I didn't know very much Spanish, and we never communicated in Spanish, but he said, "No me olvides," don't forget me. And I thought that was weird that he was saying that in a language that was sort of at a remove from us both. But, I just said goodbye and went on and was looking forward to our next get-together. And then the next morning, my alarm went off, and I hit the snooze button to snooze for another 10 minutes, and I fell into this very deep dream. And honestly, I kid you not, the dream was that somewhere there was a library that was burning. And I was awakened by his daughter calling me to tell me that the professor had died. And of course, that was a real shock. But I resolved then and there that I would continue to try to carry on the substance and the spirit of what he had taught me over 12 years, honoring that intellectual curiosity and research and sharing that with as many people as I could. And I just feel this great privilege that I sort of tumbled into a situation where I could do that on a regular basis with lots and lots of people.
the death of your mentor, who was a man of letters. We could tell that story and just like hang it out there in the air and say, we don't know what to make of that, but wow, what a coincidence. But then you went on and you said that you kind of came up with this resolve. I'm just wondering if you have any more thoughts on that for us.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I was moving in that direction. Actually, I had, by that time, I was just finishing up the manuscript for my first book, A Garden of Words, which, you know, I would go home and I would make these little index cards with notes from my discussions with the professor. And I noticed, this was before his death, I noticed that the pile of index cards that had information about flowers kept getting bigger and bigger. For example, the term gladiolus comes from the Latin gladium or gladius, which means sword, because the gladiolus has sword-shaped leaves, you know, and in German it's Schwertlily, sword lily.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, isn't that beautiful? It's so picturesque, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I really love about etymology is sometimes you just get these word pictures and then you can't not see them anymore. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool to try to do what the professor did for me, to take a word like gladiolus or daisy, which comes from Old English for day's eye, because some daisies open up during the day and then close at night, and just sort of go off on the kinds of etymological tangents that he did. And so I was trying to think of a way to sort of throw a net over what he showed me every week. And so I was packaging it as chapters in a book. And so I guess I had thought about that, about trying to package what he did for me. But boy, after I lost him, that was it. I was going to find a way to do this on a regular basis.
When you look back at the dream and his passing, and was this, I'm not going to put words in your mouth here. I'm just wondering if those events, did it kind of seal the deal for you of commitment and, I don't even know that resolve is the right word. I like commitment, because that has at its root the sense of being sent, or you sending yourself, you know, the calling or a purpose in life even. Am I saying too much about who you are and what you do?
No, it's a great question. I've never been asked this before. I'm thinking maybe the word that I felt after that, I mean, of course there was shock and of course there was grief, but I think the word that I felt was obligation. And of course I'm looking mentally at the word obligation and seeing the L-I-G in there, which has to do with tying or binding, you know, like ligature or tubal ligation.
Religion.
Or religion. Exactly. Exactly. So yeah, I think I felt bound to, I really felt an obligation. You know, he's come to the end of the road and I've got to pick up this bundle and keep carrying it myself until I guess I hand it off to somebody.
You know, obligation can be a heavy word. For some people, it can feel like a burden. Yeah. Right? But this is not what I'm hearing from you, that it was burdensome. It was like, I'm going to take this up.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it was a joyful obligation, I guess, is the way to put it. It was really a matter of joy, and it also felt like an honor. You know, my gosh, I thought so much of Professor Latkovski, and gosh, this is being handed off to me. I mean, what could be more of an honor or a privilege to keep trying in my own way to carry that on? And I think, you know, you mentioned my parents. I think it's the same thing with what my parents left me with. They were educators.
I think about that word, too, a lot. Educate, people just think you're school, but to be led out of something is, one is led out of what? Darkness or out of ignorance or confusion into a lighter. I love. You know, I want to talk about another important figure in your life whom your father met. And this is so interesting. Latkovski was a big influence on you, but a lot of people are going to know the name Martin Luther King Jr. before they know the name Leonard Latkovski. What's the intersection of Martin Luther King Jr. in your father's life and the impact it has on you? And this is not just willy-nilly, because your father loved language and learning and words. That's MLK Jr. too, and he had a way with words.
He certainly did. And in the late 1950s, my father really came to admire King's work and his social activism and his emphasis on nonviolent protest. And since my dad taught ethics at the Baptist Seminary in Louisville, he thought, well, let's get this guy to come to the seminary. And so my father extended an invitation to Martin Luther King to come speak to his ethics class, because he had all kinds of speakers come speak to his students. And Dr. King said, sure. So Dr. King in 1961 came to the Baptist Seminary in Louisville. If my house ever catches on fire, the thing that I'm going to grab on my way out is the photo of Dad and Martin Luther King having coffee together and planning civil rights strategy in the South. King was going to just speak to his classes, but this was a really turbulent time. You know, King actually had to have a police escort take him to the seminary because there had been so many threats. And when he got to the seminary, lo and behold, 500 people showed up. So they had to move his talk from my dad's classroom to the large chapel. And I remember my father saying years later that at the beginning, King didn't quite sound like the assured orator we know now. He was a little bit hesitant at first, I think, and intimidated. But boy, once he got going, he ended up with the whole crowd on their feet, and that had never happened in the chapel before.
Now, this was, of course, long before the March on Washington. Of course, he was well known, but a crowd of 500 showing up, that seems like a pretty small crowd when we look back on it. I guess it was big for your father and big for the community. A remarkable day. And from what I understand in your telling of the story elsewhere, that your father almost lost his job over this.
He did. He got into all kinds of trouble. I think there was a Time magazine poll a few years later that indicated that a lot of people hated this guy back then. We forget that. But it was a dangerous thing that my father did. He was called into the president of the seminary's office and told that the seminary was losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from churches, particularly in the South, probably to the tune of $200,000, maybe more. And my dad just kind of shrugged and said, well, that was money well spent. He was a very plain-spoken guy. I think he felt really good about what he did. And, you know, my dad wrote 14 books, and I also have a picture of him standing there with Dr. King, and Dr. King holding a copy of my father's first book, Introducing Christian Ethics. My dad gave that to him, autographed it, and said, I'd like you to have this. But King kind of made this face that indicated that he'd already had to read it in his own ethics class, but he was glad to have an inscribed copy.
You've mentioned 2 photographs. When you see those pictures, you've got the family roots and the deep affection there. That would be overpowering to me to look at that, because it's not just about a fawning lover of Martin Luther King Jr.'s work who got to meet him. There's more going on with your dad there than just a snapshot or I'll get a famous person's signature autograph.
Oh, yeah. They were actively planning civil rights strategy and King's next appearance there in Louisville and the issues there in Louisville, which at the time was a very, very segregated city.
It seems to me that your father's interest in social justice and such, certainly it goes back to being called a lint head when he worked in a mill, I would imagine.
You're absolutely right. Being called a lint head and also being called a hand. The workers there were called hands, literally. That's all they were. And he was working at age 13 in the mill before child labor laws, and there were not many protections at all. I mean, my father would stand there with a large blade cutting towels, just this repetitive motion again and again for hours and hours. And, if you lost a hand or his good friend lost a finger, and so what? The company didn't care. You were just a hand. So my father, yes, had a very, very strong sense of what it's like to be on that end of inequality. And he was very much an admirer of King and the work that he did.
Was he still alive at the time of the assassination?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was one of 2 times I ever saw my father cry.
The fact that Henlee Barnette, Martha's father, the social activist, minister, and professor of Christian ethics, the fact that he rubbed shoulders with Martin Luther King Jr. presented us quite the temptation to stray deeper into politics and the story of the struggle for civil and human rights and her connection through her father to all of this. Well, we won't even get around to the episode of his life when Henlee met in person with Nikita Khrushchev in the Kremlin in 1957. No, my actual aim and purpose in bringing up MLK with a language expert like Martha was strictly to explore the joy and wonder of words, especially words well wrought. And obviously, as a master of oratory, King fits right in with this aim. But I also got to wondering what Martha might have to say about the converse of speech, which is, of course, speechlessness. I'd like you to hear how that discussion went. I'm wondering if you have some strong views about the wonder, and not just the curiosity aspect, but the awesomeness of language.
The awesomeness of language, just the fact that we are the only creatures on the planet who can do what we're doing. Communicating by making these sounds and writing these symbols is something that we take for granted every day. And this is the last thing we should take for granted. And I always tell people, if you're curious about a word, my gosh, go look it up, because you might find some wonderful surprises in the origins there. But you're talking about the fact that, for example, you and I are having a conversation, right?
Well, I guess here's the thing, Martha, that really gets at my heart and my mind at the same time.
Okay.
It's this business of speechlessness. We have an experience that robs us of the ability, not the desire. We still want to convey what we are experiencing, but we know that ultimately we can't. This is what the behavioral psychologists are talking about when they talk about awe. They're talking about being overwhelmed and not being able to really comprehend. There's another one. You can't grasp it. To comprehend is to grasp something. You
or
can't
to
grasp
fathom.
Speechlessness. I know you've got a few words on that.
A few words on speechlessness. Well, speechlessness is kind of beautiful too, isn't it? I mean, I'm thinking about those images from the Artemis flight and the images from the James Webb telescope. I mean, I hate to say it, but language is inadequate, isn't it? It's what you feel is ineffable. It's not up to the task for some things. And as a language person, I hate to say that, but since you're pressing on that, speechlessness is great, isn't it?
Well, I think that the psychologists who study awe would say that about 75% of the people who have an experience of awe, whether it's with language or elsewhere, they find that as a positive event. And the others feel sometimes worse than stymied. It's actually kind of a negative experience to have awe. So the overwhelm feels like you've lost some control. And if you're a person inclined to controlling your environment and not being at risk, and then to be left without the means to cope with what's happening can be really frightening to some people. And I think that's where awe actually comes from. Reverence also comes from fear. Are you ever afraid when the words are lacking?
I'm lacking words right now. Yes, I think that's kind of that requires a certain amount of discipline, doesn't it? To just sort of sit with whatever it is, to sit with awe or to sit with, as you said, overwhelm. I think that we as humans are always trying to put our mark on things, to put our stamp on things, to fix things, and to just let yourself relax and take it in. I mean, I guess people find different ways to do that.
Well, I love what you're saying, though, to sit with it, because that is an attentiveness that
Yes.
is, I think, it can be transformative to us if we're willing to go there, if we're willing to go there.
Yeah. I feel like everything I'm saying is inadequate, but I'm thinking about the experience of grief and having a grieving person in your life that you want to comfort. You know, we want to come up with all these great words, or we hesitate to write a thank you note because we don't know what words we should be using. But the fact is that you can't fix it. I mean, my dad always talked about how, in the Bible it talks about by the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept. Sometimes all you can do is just sit next to the person and, not say a word. And that, I think, is more meaningful than any kind of Hallmark card you could come up with. That shared, and I think in a positive way too. If you're spending time with a person and you just have this companionable silence, there's something really beautiful about that when you know that you don't have to say words, that there's enough of something between you, enough of communication between you that words are unnecessary.
Sometimes words will span decades before we hear them, and I know you got to hear your father's voice in the recording in that lecture hall with Martin Luther King Jr. What went through you when you first heard that recording?
Oh, this is amazing. I had always seen the photos of my dad and Martin Luther King. They were on the wall at our house, and I have copies myself. But just a few years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, a friend of mine sent me a text and said, "Did you know that there's a recording of your father and Martin Luther King that you can listen to online?" And I was shocked because we lost my dad back in 2004. And, I haven't listened to his voice since then. And here's a recording of my dad introducing Martin Luther King to his students. It was shocking and wonderful. The hairs on the back of my neck just went up. I still feel that right now because, my dad was a very learned man, but he also had this beautiful Western North Carolina drawl, this Southern drawl. And he also had a very dry sense of humor. And so to hear that voice, and in that particular context too, it would have been amazing to hear his voice at any time, but to hear his voice saying things that I'd never heard him say before, and he happened to be saying them to Martin Luther King, just left me speechless, left me breathless.
We are honored to have him and grateful for the opportunity to hear him speak to us today. I am aware of the fact that my classes in Christian ethics have grown considerably since yesterday. We're happy to have other classes joining us and professors who didn't get up their lectures for today.
Something about the sound of his voice and the cadence and the music of his voice immediately sent me back. It was like when you get a whiff of something and all of a sudden you're just whisked right back to first grade, the smell of the paste you used to eat or whatever. I just got whisked back decades to a time I remember where my dad took my brother Jim and me to the log cabin where he had been born on the side of Sugarloaf Mountain. I remembered that day so clearly as a result of hearing the music of his voice.
as long as we've been talking about that speechlessness, you've mentioned in your book thin places, and it kind of connects here. What are thin places? What does that mean for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about that as you were talking earlier. Thin places are those places where you have that kind of sense of wonder and speechlessness. It may be gazing out at the Grand Canyon. I've had it many times when I hike to the top of a mountain. You might walk into a big, beautiful church and feel it, or just someplace out in nature. And the term thin places refers to kinds of places where I guess the boundary between the physical world that we know and a world beyond that, I've often described it as feeling like I'm just seeing a scrim, like you would see on a theatrical stage. And, maybe you could just punch your fist right through it and get to the other side. A lot of people talk about thin places, and they have lots of different ways of describing them. But for me, it's that liminal space, liminal from the Latin word for threshold, limen. It's that liminal space between here and there. And that's a good place, though, to just sit with silence, right? I think it really is. Just take it in, be a part of it. And I think it's one of those places, too, where you don't feel a boundary between yourself and whatever is immense there. I don't know, looking at the sky, going to a dark sky reserve or something, and just looking up and feeling that.
You're listening to Constant Wonder. I'm Marcus Smith. I've had opportunity to visit with more than just one of our guests about the almost otherworldly experience of suddenly realizing you're in a thin place. And it always gets me thinking about times when words have been fully inadequate for me to express that feeling. But I never give up on words completely. That's why we have this podcast. Martha Barnette is author of Friends with Words, Adventures in Language Land. Moving on now from the sublime to the not utterly but nearly ridiculous, just listen to where things went next. My great-aunt Zola lived in a little tiny town in eastern Utah, and she was the one who knew all the gossip, and so she would write the social column in the local newspaper, the Roosevelt Standard, I think it was called. And she'd be on the phone learning stories, and she was with my grandmother one day. My grandmother fancied herself prim and proper, although she was a ranch woman with just recent Scandinavian ancestry of some pretty poor people. She told a story to my great-aunt Zola, and she said, "This is what happened." But Zola had already heard about it. And so Zola said, "Why, Geneva? I knowed that for years and years to come." That's kind of a strange verbs and tenses going on there.
That's a gem. I knowed that for years to come.
That's the way it was reported to me by my grandmother, yes.
Oh, that just gives me chills. I've never heard that one, but it makes a kind of weird sense, doesn't it?
I'm trying to.
I knowed that for years to come? Wow.
This is a challenge. I want to know if you can top that.
Yeah, that just leaves me speechless. If I can top that, my goodness.
Yeah, well, we've hit a linguistic thick place is what we've done right there.
Exactly. Yeah, we've hit a linguistic thick place. And of course, what happens when somebody brings this kind of thing to my attention, the first thing I want to do is go look at the research on this and see if other people say that. I've known this for years to come. I'm making a note right now.
Maybe it was her idiom. It was just her own idiomatic way.
It could have been her own idiolect, but I'm making a note right now.
Of course you are. Oh, also from eastern Utah is something that we used to call the Utah double subjunctive, and I don't know that that's accurate at all, but a lot of people would say, well, we could do that. And so you double. Is that a formal term? Am I in the ballpark?
It's called a double modal, and it's not just Utah by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, my dad's Appalachian family said Mike could all the time. There's a whole website about these. The Yale Grammatical Diversity Project has a whole treatise on might could and might would and expressions like that. They're called double modals, and they're very old.
When you hear that, does it catch your ear still?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because, it's the footprints of immigrants, actually. It's might could is a vestige of these early settlers in this country.
Well, let me give you a footprint of immigrants. I was visiting the same grandmother years ago. I was a teenager, and I would say, yeah. Mm-hmm. And that was my affirmative for yes. And she called me out, and she said, Marcus, the word is yes. And can't you say yes? And I looked at her and I said, Grandma, I think your parents were from Denmark. And I think the Germanic way was more like ja. Mm-hmm. And I put it on her, and she was not happy, and that's where my story ends.
Yeah. I say yeah all the time, and it's funny the things that people decide to be sticklers about, because that's one way to answer in the affirmative, but it's not the only one.
Yeah. Let's take a little bit of time to talk about people's language pet peeves, because I have a few pet peeves, and I don't think they might not be legit, but when people say reoccur instead of recur, because that's the norm these days to say reoccur, and I prefer recur, and am I being just wrong-headed? Am I a purist? Am I misinformed? What's wrong with me on my pet peeve here?
Well, nothing's wrong with you. Actually, they mean two slightly different things. I think recur means to happen again and again and again, and reoccur,
a single
technically,
instance, maybe.
Yeah.
Oh, see how wrong-headed I can be.
Well, that's why we have to be we have to be careful about pet peeves, because sometimes you'll find out that your pet peeve isn't really a pet peeve at all. I like to describe our show as a spay and neuter program for your pet peeves. Because, so many of those so-called rules of grammar that we learned and that my mother, the English teacher, taught me aren't necessarily applicable. They were instituted by 17th and 18th century grammarians, self-styled grammarians, who decided that you couldn't end a sentence with a preposition, because what they were trying to do was fit the swollen foot of English into the too tight shoes of Latin grammar. You can't end a sentence in Latin, as you know, with a preposition, because that's not the way Latin works. Or splitting an infinitive. Please, you're welcome to split infinitives. In Latin, infinitives are one word, and it was the same thing in Old English as well.
Who's the person who said that is one silliness up with which I will not put?
Yes.
I don't remember who that was.
Well, some people say it was Winston Churchill, but I believe that there have been earlier instances of that. But yeah, I love that. Errant nonsense up with which I will not put.
Oh, there we go. Well, on your show then, the podcast, the radio show, Away with Words, how much of time do you have to dedicate to this issue of what's proper? Because I would imagine after a lot of episodes, you feel, haven't we done this? Haven't we kind of litigated this before?
Well, it's funny. Early on, now, mind you, I've been doing this show for more than 20 years now, which still shocks me. Early on, when people were getting to know the show, I think they called in with more questions like that. Is this proper English? Or English is going to hell in a handbasket. And by the way, where does that come from? And we don't know. It's just nice alliteration, and a handbasket is kind of nice and lightweight. But that's all we know about that.
It's a very strange mode of conveyance.
Yeah, it really is, a little handbasket. But I think over time, as listeners have kind of gotten to know my co-host Grant Barrett and me — Grant is a dictionary editor, a lexicographer — as they've gotten to know us and our connections with linguists, I think they've come to appreciate the great diversity of English. There's so many different kinds of English, whether you're talking about Ghanaian English or Trinidadian English or British English or Canadian Australian or New Zealand English. There are all different kinds of varieties of saying things, and what we like to do on the show is celebrate those.
I had a fun time with the back formations in your book when I was reading it.
Back formations like what, for example?
Where the verb is turned into a noun, or maybe it's the other way around.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about denominalization, right? Denominalization is when you take a noun and you make a verb out of it. You know, people get really upset if you talk about so-and-so podiumed at the Olympics, for example. But this is a process that happens a lot in English. I think about a fifth of English words started their lives as nouns and then became verbs. And for anybody who's upset about that process, you hear it more and more. And I know people get bothered by it, but I would just suggest they email me or phone me.
Well, let's see what else I can pack in here before this episode ends. I'm going to pick a word, not totally random here, but it was one of my favorites. The word is scintillate.
Oh, I love the word scintillate. It comes from the Latin scintilla, which means spark. So if you're having a sparkling conversation, as I hope we are, that's a scintillating conversation. And you might say that's like being asked to choose a favorite star in the sky. Or I was recently reading an anthology, and I was thinking about how much I love the word anthology. You know, it comes from the Greek anthos, meaning flower. So we get chrysanthemum from that, which means golden flower, and anthurium, which literally means a flower with a tail, if you go back to the roots. And anthology is literally a gathering of flowers. The Latin word is florilegium. I think of it as a literary bouquet. I think of that word and I just think, gosh, I want everybody to know what a gorgeous word that is. I walk around with these things in my head and just want to share them with people.
Many thanks to our guest, Martha Barnette, co-host of Away with Words and author of several books about language and words. If you can think of somebody who would enjoy this episode, please pass it along. We invite you to help us connect with more and more people in the effort to highlight the quest for wonder in the world. And we would also love for you to visit us on Substack, where you can find episode transcripts and other funny, bonusy type things. Find us on the web at constantwonder.substack.com. This week you can find the photos of Martha's father with Martin Luther King Jr. and a link to King's lecture that we spoke about that was given at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. This episode was produced by Jess Scoville with help from Mamie Teeples and Haley Harris. Sound designed by Taehan Kim. I'm Marcus Smith. Constant Wonder is a production of BYU Radio. I'd like to introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show, hosted by comedian, believer, and single mother Lisa Valentine Clark. The Lisa Show delves into most any challenge that meets us in the course of our lives, especially challenges in the realm of human relationships, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, or social issues. Lisa and her council of moms are willing to tackle it. Figuring life out is vexing enough without losing an ability to laugh or cry together or just plain talk things through. The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.